I was kneeling among the chrysanthemums, dirt under my nails, when the slam came. The sound echoed across the garden, sharper than the October wind off the lake. Daniel stood behind the glass door, my house keys dangling from his fingers. "You're not coming back inside, Mom. We need our own space." His voice was flat, like he'd rehearsed it. Behind him, warm light spilled over polished floors, and the smell of cinnamon pie drifted out. Folks, what would you do if your own child locked you out of the home you built? Would you fight for your place or walk away? Tell me in the comments, because in that moment I had to choose. The air bit through my sweater, sliding icy fingers down my spine. A laugh, hers, his wife's, rose from the kitchen, soft and cutting all at once. Through the window, glasses clinked, someone turned up the music. I'd been here before, in smaller ways, the phone calls only when bills needed paying. The quick thanks, that felt more like obligation than gratitude. But this was different. This was a line drawn in the cold Vermont dirt. I pressed my hands into my knees, steadying myself. If I looked long enough, maybe Daniel's eyes would soften, maybe he'd open the door. But his gaze slid past me to someone else in the room. The click of the deadbolt was louder than it should have been. I turned toward the lake. Leaves skittered across the gravel path, crunching under my worn garden shoes. The water was steel gray, restless under a bruised sky. I'd walked this path 1,000 times, on mornings when my husband was still alive, when Daniel was small enough to carry in my arms, his head warm against my neck. I remembered selling my engagement ring to cover Daniel's first semester at college, skipping vacations so he could take an unpaid internship in Boston. This house, was kept in my name to protect it for him, or so I thought. Sacrifice had been my second skin, but skins can be shed. Halfway down the path I stopped. From here I could see the side porch, its door still ajar, a faint slice of yellow light spilling out. One step, and I could be inside before anyone noticed. One step, and I'd pretend nothing had happened. I didn't move. Instead, I slipped my hands into the pockets of my coat. My right hand closed around cold metal, a spare key I'd kept for years. The weight of it steadied me. Keys aren't just to houses, they're to dignity, to choice. I walked on, past the boathouse, where the cedar planks smelled of rain. Past the bench where my husband and I planned our retirement trips we never took. The gravel gave way to the soft crunch of pine needles, and with each step, the noise from the house faded. I thought about the last time Daniel hugged me without looking at his watch. I thought about the way his wife's smile never reached her eyes. And I thought about the bank envelope in my desk drawer. The one with the deed, the savings statements, and the letter my husband wrote before he died. "Protect what's yours, Maggie. Protect yourself." For the wind shifted, bringing the lake's sharp scent and a sudden stillness. I knew where I was going. Not back to the house. To someone who would understand that dignity isn't negotiable. And that some locks are meant to be changed, not opened. But I'll tell you this. The moment I walked past that side door, I stopped being the woman who waited for permission to enter her own life. I became the woman who decided who would be welcome in it. The lake in autumn had always been my anchor. After Harold died, it was the one constant, still and vast, even on restless days. I'd stand at the kitchen window, hands wrapped around a chipped mug, steam rising from coffee gone bitter, watching Daniel chase gulls along the shoreline. Back then, he was 8 and fearless. I worked double shifts at the elementary school, covering for sick teachers, tutoring after hours. Every extra dollar went into the envelope marked Daniel's future, taped inside the pantry where he couldn't reach. Sometimes I'd slide the envelope out, count the bills, and wonder if it would ever be enough. We didn't take vacations. The closest we came was a Saturday drive into Burlington, stopping for pie at the diner with the squeaky red booths. He'd order apple, I'd take cherry, and we'd trade bites without asking. It was the kind of quiet joy that made the long weeks feel worth it. I sold my engagement ring the year he was accepted to the university. The jeweler's light made the diamond seem colder than I remembered. He counted out the cash without looking me in the eye. I told myself Harold would have done the same, anything to give Daniel a head start. Winters were the hardest. The wind off the lake crept into every corner of the old house. I learned how to seal windows with plastic sheets, wearing 2 sweaters while grading papers at the kitchen table. Daniel studied in the next room, his pencil scratching in steady rhythm. I used to believe those nights would be the foundation he'd stand on forever. The first shift came quietly, a summer visit home, after his first year away. He spent more time on the phone than at the dinner table. When I asked about classes, he gave short answers, eyes drifting toward the screen lighting his palm. It was subtle then. A missed birthday call, an unreturned letter. I kept telling myself he was busy, building his life. That's what I'd prepared him for, wasn't it? To stand on his own, even if it meant standing apart from me. But sometimes, late at night, I'd find myself at the desk in Harold's study. The scent of his old pipe tobacco still lingered in the wood. I'd run my fingers over the sealed manila envelope. The deed, the savings, the will. And whisper into the empty room, "We're still keeping him safe, aren't we?" The room never answered, but the lake outside kept its promise. Steady. Waiting, even when everything else began to change. When Daniel graduated, the spring air smelled of lilacs and wet pavement. I sat in the crowded auditorium, clutching a bouquet wrapped in cheap cellophane. He scanned the rows without spotting me, his smile broad but distant. Afterward, he hugged me quickly, one arm already pulling out his phone for a photo with friends. I told myself it was the rush of the day, that once the noise settled, we'd have time for just us. But the ride back to Lakeview was quiet, filled with him scrolling through messages I couldn't see. His first apartment was barely furnished, yet I brought over bags of groceries, a set of clean towels, a cast iron skillet from our kitchen. "Mom, you don't have to keep doing this," he said, half laughing, half annoyed. I brushed it off, telling him, a home starts with the little things. By the time he married, visits felt rehearsed. Polite questions, short answers. My chair at the table slowly shifted closer to the edge of the room. I noticed how his wife's voice brightened for her parents, how her laugh softened when they spoke. With me, the air seemed thinner, every word weighed. Holidays became optional. One Thanksgiving, he called the day before to say they were, keeping it small. That year, I made a single plate of stuffing and turkey, ate it at the counter, and told the lake everything I'd planned to say to him. Still, I kept giving. A check when their car broke down, covering the difference on a mortgage payment when a bonus didn't come through. Each time Daniel promised he'd make it up to me. Each time, I believed him. Because believing was easier than admitting the truth. It was Harold's voice I heard in those quiet hours. The way he'd stand in the doorway of the study, leaning on the frame, saying, "Maggie, love is action. Words come cheap." Or I clung to that, thinking my actions would speak loud enough for all of us. But the years thinned the thread between us. By the autumn, when the chrysanthemums bloomed brighter than I'd seen in decades, the thread was frayed to a whisper. I had no way of knowing it would snap in a single afternoon. With a slam of a door, a set of keys in the wrong hands, and my own son's voice telling me I no longer belonged. The lake was still there that day, the same steady gray, but I was no longer the woman who believed presence alone could keep someone close. That belief had been buried, somewhere between the kitchen window and the locked front door. 2 weeks after the garden incident, Daniel called. His tone was light, almost forced. "Come by for dinner, Mom. We can talk." Hey, the street was slick with rain when I pulled up to their driveway. From the porch, I could see the dining room through the wide front window. Candles flickered, glasses already half full. I told myself it was a chance to smooth the edges. Inside, the air was warm with the smell of rosemary chicken. Plates gleamed under the soft light, every fork placed at perfect angles. Daniel kissed my cheek quickly, then stepped aside. His wife, Claire, lingered by the table, her smile thin. We made it halfway through the salad before it happened. Claire set down her fork, eyes sweeping the table like a teacher checking homework. "So, Margaret, how's the garden? Must be nice to have so much free time." Her voice held that careful lilt, sweet on the surface, sharp underneath. I felt the room still. Daniel sipped his wine, eyes fixed on the bottle. The clink of cutlery seemed louder than it should have been. I said, "The chrysanthemums are holding up well this year." My hand stayed steady on the fork, but my chest tightened. Claire leaned in, her bracelets chiming. "Maybe you could use some of that time to learn something new. Keep up with the world a bit." The words hung there, heavy and deliberate. A small laugh escaped her, the kind meant to invite others to join. Daniel didn't. He just buttered another roll. I thought about all the nights I'd graded papers until my eyes blurred. About the ring I'd sold, the winters wrapped in 2 sweaters to save for him. Free time. The phrase felt like a stone dropped in my coffee. I reached for my water, letting the cool glass anchor me. Claire's phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at it, then back at me. "You're lucky, really. No deadlines, no pressure. Just coasting. Her eyes met mine then, bright unblinking. I recognized the look. It wasn't curiosity, it was a test. I kept my voice calm. Coasting takes balance, Claire. Some of us learn it after years of keeping others from sinking. The silence that followed was a different kind of loud. Daniel cleared his throat, asked if anyone wanted more chicken. No one did. From the window behind him, I could see the rain sliding down the glass, each drop catching the porch light before disappearing into the dark. It reminded me of things slipping away quietly until you look up one day and realize they're gone. The conversation limped along after that. Daniel asked about the weather, the lake levels, anything that didn't touch nerves. I answered politely, tasting none of the food. Halfway through dessert, Claire struck again. She was telling a story about a colleague's retirement, how he traveled the world now, finally useful to himself. Then her eyes cut toward me. Some people never figure out what to do once they're done. The fork paused halfway to my mouth. She smiled as if she'd complimented the pie. Daniel shifted in his seat but said nothing. I set the fork down. The china made a soft tap against the wood. In my head, Harold's voice murmured, "Love is action." Words come cheap. This was neither. Claire kept going. It must be strange, Margaret, going from busy days to, well, just tending plants. Relying on others for the big stuff. Her tone was honey, but her words carried the weight of a lock turning in a door. I felt heat rise in my chest. Though the air in the room stayed still, my hands rested on the edge of the table, fingers curled slightly, nails pressing into my palms. I've always managed the big stuff, Claire. Some of us don't announce it. We just do it. Her smile didn't falter, but a faint line appeared between her brows. For a moment, I thought she might back down. Instead, she turned to Daniel. "You're lucky I handle things directly. Saves you from having to fill in the gaps." That was it. A clear public accounting of my worth, rendered at 0. I took a sip of water, letting the coolness settle the heat in my throat. Daniel glanced at me, almost quick enough to hide it, as if gauging how far I'd been before breaking. The rest of the evening moved in fragments. The plates stacking, chairs scraping, the quiet shuffle to the door. Claire's goodnight was a perfumed brush of air near my cheek. Daniel's hug was brief, his hand already reaching for the knob. Outside, the rain was steady, the kind that soaked you in minutes. I pulled my coat tighter and stepped into it, the gravel soft under my shoes. Behind me, the porch light clicked off. Walking to the car, I felt each drop like a small punctuation mark. They stitched together every choice I'd made to put him first, every sacrifice I'd folded into the seams of our lives. By the time I started the engine, my hair clung to my face. The windshield wipers swept away the blur, but inside, nothing cleared. I drove toward the lake, the road curving like a question I wasn't ready to answer. Not yet, but the answer was forming, somewhere between the sting of rain and the silence in my chest. The envelope arrived on a Thursday, buried beneath grocery flyers and a charity appeal. It was thick, cream-colored, the kind that usually marked weddings or wills. My name was printed in sharp black type, no return address. I set it on the kitchen counter, beside the mug still warm from my morning coffee. The lake was restless outside the window, clouds folding over the water like damp linen. I slit the envelope open with the butter knife, careful though my hand already knew this wouldn't be good news. Inside, a letter from the bank and a set of forms. The letter thanked me for initiating the transfer of funds from my savings into a joint account. I hadn't. The forms carried my name in faint gray beneath the signature line. All that was missing was the ink of my consent. The phone rang. Daniel's voice was brisk, almost cheerful. "Hey, Mom, just a heads up. You'll get some papers from the bank. Go ahead and sign them. It's just to make things simpler if something ever happens." Something. The word was casual in his mouth, but it landed heavy in mine. "What kind of simpler?" I asked. He exhaled, the sound of someone explaining a minor chore. "So Claire and I can help manage bills, you know. Taxes, upkeep on the house. It's a hassle for you to deal with alone." I looked around the kitchen. The walls I'd painted myself. The clock Harold hung above the pantry, still ticking steady. "I've been managing it for decades," I said. A pause. Then, lighter, don't make this a big deal. It's just paper? Paper that could shift the ground under my feet. Paper that could turn a lifetime into someone else's asset overnight. "I'll think about it," I told him. His sigh was soft but sharp. "Fine. But the sooner the better. It's time sensitive." After we hung up, I laid the forms flat on the table. The bank seal gleamed under the overhead light. My name looked small there, surrounded by lines meant for other hands. I made tea the kind Harold used to brew on long winter nights. The steam curled up, carrying the faint scent of peppermint. I sipped it slowly, eyes fixed on the space for my signature. A knock at the door startled me. When I opened it, Claire stood there, holding a Tupperware of cookies. "Thought you might like a treat," she said, stepping inside without waiting. Her eyes landed on the papers. "Oh, good, you've got them. Saves us a trip?" She set the cookies down, slid into the chair opposite mine. "Let's just sign and be done?" I rested my hand over the forms. Her smile stayed in place, but her fingers tapped an impatient rhythm on the table. "It's really in everyone's best interest, Margaret. You trust us, don't you?" The question hung there, heavier than the lake air before a storm. I didn't answer her question right away. The clock above the pantry ticked 3 times before I spoke. "I've always handled my own affairs, Claire. That hasn't changed." How she leaned back, crossing one leg over the other. The movement was casual, but her eyes stayed locked on mine. "Of course. But things happen fast, Margaret. Illness, accidents, it's smart to be prepared." "Prepared for what?" The thought slid through me like a cold draft. I kept my face neutral, the way I used to when a student tried to bluff their way through an excuse. "This is something I'll review on my own time." Her smile tightened, just enough to notice. "Well, don't take too long. The bank has deadlines." She stood, smoothing her blouse. "Daniel will check in later. We just want to make sure you're comfortable." The word sat wrong like a spoon scraping the bottom of a pot. I walked her to the door. Rain had started again, tapping softly on the porch roof. After she left, I locked the door. The key turned with a click that felt louder than it should. Back at the table, the papers waited, flat and expectant. I slid them into the drawer with the unopened charity appeal. I needed to see for myself. Pulling the laptop closer, I logged into my bank account. The numbers loaded slowly, the spinning icon like a held breath. When the screen finally settled, the air in the kitchen felt heavier. A transfer? 2 weeks ago? Nearly $5,000 gone. Labeled simply, "Joint expense settlement." No explanation, no note. My fingers curled against the edge of the counter. It could have been a mistake. Banks made them all the time, didn't they? But the name linked to the joint account told me otherwise. Daniel. I closed the laptop gently, as if noise might shatter something else I wasn't ready to face. The peppermint steam from my tea had faded, leaving only the faint metallic scent of the kettle. In the quiet, I heard the hum of the refrigerator, the steady tick of the clock, ordinary sounds in a house that suddenly felt foreign. I stood by the window, watching the rain gather on the deck rail. Drops clung there, trembling before they fell. I thought of how quickly something could be taken, how one moment you held it, the next it slipped away. When the phone rang again, I let it go to voicemail. Daniel's voice filled the small speaker on the counter. "Mom, just checking in. Hope you're looking over those forms. We can stop by tomorrow if you've got questions." Questions. I had more than he could ever answer honestly. But for now, I stayed still, the lake beyond the glass dark and rippling. A surface that looked calm, while the current underneath pulled hard. The days after the bank discovery blurred together. Phone calls from Daniel became shorter, his tone clipped, always ending with, "We'll talk soon." His soon never came. I'd pass people at the market who used to stop and chat over apples or bread. Now their smiles were polite, quick, eyes sliding away as if late for something. I wondered what they'd heard. In towns like Lakeview, silence often carried the loudest rumors. The house felt bigger somehow, the air heavier. Rooms I used to move through without thinking became places I avoided. The dining table sat bare. The runner Harold's mother had soon folded neatly in a drawer. Even the radio in the kitchen stayed off. I couldn't bear the cheerful voices that didn't belong to anyone I knew. One morning, the lake lay still under a sheet of pale fog. I was on the porch, wrapped in Harold's old coat, when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. A small blue hatchback pulled up. Out stepped Emily Parker, the daughter of my late friend June. She held a paper bag in both hands. "Mom used to say your coffee cake could fix any bad day." She smiled. "I can't bake, but I figured muffins might do in a pinch." Her hair was damp from the mist curling around her face. The scent of cinnamon escaped the bag as she passed it to me. For a moment, the porch felt warmer. We sat at the kitchen table, steam rising from our mugs. Emily talked about her classes at the community college, the part-time job at the library. I found myself listening more than speaking, grateful for a voice that didn't measure every word. "You've been quiet lately?" she said softly. "Everything all right?" I hesitated. The truth was too heavy to drop between us. Instead, I said, "Just keeping to myself." She didn't press. Some people have a gift for leaving space without making it feel empty. When she left, she promised to stop by next week with a book she thought I'd like. After the door closed, the quiet settled in again. But it was different this time, less like a wait, more like a pause. I carried the muffins to the counter, the paper bag still warm against my palms. Outside, the fog had begun to lift. The far shore of the lake emerged slowly, as if it had been there all along, waiting for the right moment to be seen. I stood there a while, the scent of cinnamon mingling with the cool lake air. The loneliness hadn't vanished, but it no longer filled every corner. Some spaces, I realized, could be reclaimed, one small kindness at a time. The days grew shorter, the lake turning from slate blue to the dark steel of November. Leaves that had blazed gold and crimson now lay pressed flat against the damp ground, their colors muted to rust and brown. Daniel didn't call again. Claire sent a single text about a family thing. They were too busy to explain. I didn't ask. There was no point in pulling at a thread that would only unravel what was left. At the market, I caught snippets of conversations. My name, followed by lowered voices. Once, Mrs. Turner from the post office nodded politely but didn't meet my eyes. The space between me and the rest of Lakeview felt like a widening path I couldn't cross. The house began to mirror that distance. Chairs sat untouched. The guest room door stayed shut. In the evenings, I read by the fire, the ticking of the clock loud enough to remind me I was the only one there to hear it. On the first real frost, Emily appeared again, cheeks pink from the cold. She carried a thermos under one arm and a second-hand novel in the other. "Hot cider?" she announced, setting the thermos down. "Figured you could use something to cut the chill." But the cider was sweet and spiced, steam curling up to fog my glasses. We talked about nothing urgent. Her exams, a stray cat she was trying to befriend, the way the frost made the lake look like glass. Her voice filled the kitchen in a way that made it feel like a home again, if only for an hour. When she left, she pressed the book into my hands. "I think you'll like it. It's about someone who finds her way back, even when no one believes she can." I traced the worn cover long after she'd gone, the words echoing in the quiet. "Find your way back." The idea felt foreign and familiar all at once. That night, I stood by the window in Harold's old coat, watching the moon silver the lake. The wind rattled the bare branches, the sound thin but steady. I thought of how isolation worked. Not always as a sudden storm, but as a slow freeze. One day you're part of the current, the next you're a piece of ice drifting on the edge. The phone stayed silent. I didn't mind. Some silences were empty, but some gave you room to listen to yourself. And in that space, I began to hear something faint but certain. A part of me that wasn't ready to sink beneath the cold. Emily's visits had planted a small, stubborn warmth. It wasn't enough to thaw everything yet, but it was enough to remind me that not all doors were locked. And maybe, just maybe, there were keys I still held. The invitation came in a cream-colored envelope, the handwriting unmistakably Daniel's. "Would love for you to come by Saturday evening." The note read, "No agendas, just family." For days, I told myself it was a chance to start over. I baked an apple crisp, the way Harold liked it, letting the smell of cinnamon and butter fill the kitchen. Maybe. I thought this was how bridges got rebuilt, one small gesture at a time. The evening was sharp with winter air when I arrived. Light spilled from their windows, warm and golden against the frost gathering on the lawn. Lauder drifted through the door before I even knocked. Daniel opened it, smiling just wide enough to be polite. "Glad you could make it, Mom." He took the apple crisp, setting it aside without lifting the foil. Inside, the living room was crowded. Coats draped over chairs, glasses clinking, the smell of roast beef and rosemary thick in the air. Claire moved between guests like she owned the light in the room. When she spotted me, her smile flashed quick and bright. "Oh, Margaret, you made it! Everyone, this is Daniel's mother," she announced, her voice carrying over the music. A few heads turned, offering nods before returning to their conversations. I found a seat near the end of the buffet, where the chatter softened enough to catch my breath. From here, I could see Claire refilling drinks, her laughter sliding easily into every pocket of the room. Dinner was served at a long table dressed in white linen. I sat midway down, between a man I didn't know and one of Claire's cousins. The hum of conversation swelled, silverware tapping plates, the air warm with wine and the scent of gravy. It began halfway through the meal. Claire stood, glass in hand, tapping it lightly with her fork. "I just want to thank everyone for being here tonight," she said, eyes sweeping the table. Then her gaze landed on me. "And of course, a special thank you to Margaret for taking time out of her very flexible schedule to join us." A few polite chuckles rippled along the table. I forced a smile, the heat rising just under my collar. She went on, her tone sweet, her words sharp. "It's so nice when everyone can contribute in their own way. Some bring wine, some bring dessert, and some, well, bring their presents." The laughter this time was louder, fuller. Daniel looked down at his plate, cutting his roast into smaller and smaller pieces. I heard the scrape of my own fork against porcelain, the sound far too loud in my ears. I thought of Emily's cider, of Harold's voice telling me dignity was non-negotiable. My hand stayed still, but my chest tightened, each breath measured. Claire raised her glass again. "To family, old and new, and to knowing your place in it." The words landed heavy, their meaning unmistakable. I didn't move. The room was too bright, the air too thick with perfume and roasted meat. Somewhere, someone laughed again, a sound sharp enough to slice through the clink of silverware. The apple crisp sat untouched at the end of the buffet, foil still crimped tight at the edges. I kept my eyes on the tablecloth, tracing the embroidered leaves with the tip of my finger. The fabric was smooth, expensive, the kind Claire would never risk staining herself. Around me, the conversations resumed, but they skirted my side of the table, leaving me in a pocket of isolation. Daniel leaned toward the man beside him, asking about some investment. He didn't glance my way, didn't try to ease the sting hanging in the air. When dessert was served, Claire appeared at my shoulder, her smile polished. "Margaret, would you mind helping in the kitchen? We're short on plates." Where the tone was light, but the words landed like an order. I folded my napkin carefully, placing it beside my plate. "I think you've got more capable hands for that tonight." Her smile faltered just enough for me to see the irritation underneath before she turned away. I slipped from the table, moving toward the quieter edge of the living room. Near the hallway to the kitchen, two voices carried through the half-open door. Claire's, crisp and certain. "Once we have her settled in assisted living, everything will be streamlined. No more back and forth about the house or accounts." A man's voice, one I didn't recognize, answered, "You'll have to get her to sign eventually." Claire laughed softly. "Oh, she will. It's just a matter of timing." My grip tightened around the strap of my bag. For a moment, the sounds of the party faded, the clink of glasses, the swell of laughter. All I heard was the echo of that laugh and the word timing. I stepped back before they could see me, finding a spot near the front window. Outside, the frost had thickened on the lawn, glittering under the porch light. I focused on the cold beyond the glass, letting it steady my breathing. The apple crisp still sat untouched on the buffet. One of Claire's friends leaned over it, lifting the foil. "Who brought this?" she asked. Claire's answer floated back, light and dismissive. "Oh, just something she threw together." I slipped into the hall, retrieving my coat from the pile on the chair. No one stopped me, not even Daniel, who was now laughing at some story from across the table. At the door, I paused long enough to hear Claire's voice rise again, toasting to fresh starts and clean slates. I stepped outside before the glasses clinked. The night air was sharp, the cold sliding through the seams of my coat. Breath hung in small clouds before my face as I walked down the path to the car. Each step crunched over frost, the sound crisp and final. From the driver's seat, I looked back once. Through the window, the golden light shimmered, warm and distant, like a place I no longer belonged to. I started the engine, the headlights sweeping across the lawn. The road home curved along the lake, the dark water catching the moonlight in restless flashes. Somewhere between those curves, the anger settled into something heavier, a quiet, deliberate resolve. They thought timing was theirs to control, but they'd forgotten I'd spent a lifetime learning patience. And patience, in the right hands, was just another word for preparation. The morning after the party, I woke before dawn. The lake was a flat sheet of pewter, the horizon only a thin line between water and sky. Sleep had been shallow, my dreams crowded with half-heard voices and the clink of Claire's glass. I made coffee and carried the mug to Harold's old study. The room smelled faintly of cedar and dust, a scent that clung to the wainscoting no matter how many times I opened the windows. In the corner stood the tall oak filing cabinet, the bottom drawer heavier than the rest. The key hung on a chain inside my jewelry box. It took 2 tries to fit it into the lock, The metal was cold, biting at my fingers. When the drawer slid open, the air inside had the dry, papery smell of years gone untouched. I pulled out folders, each labeled in Harold's careful block letters. Mortgage? Insurance? Taxes. Most were thick with receipts and correspondence, the edges soft from handling. Near the back, wedged between two binders, was a manila envelope with my name written in Harold's hand. The ink had faded to brown, but the curve of the M was as familiar as his voice. Inside were documents I hadn't seen in years, a copy of our original deed, the title clear and unencumbered, a will naming me sole owner of the house and all attached property, and a handwritten note dated the year before he died. "Maggie, keep these safe. They are your security no matter what happens." A paper trembled in my hands. It wasn't fear, at least not entirely. It was the weight of realizing that everything Daniel and Claire had implied at that table, every insinuation about managing the house or making things simpler, had no legal ground. I set the documents on the desk, smoothing the creases. The window beside me rattled as a gust came off the lake, scattering a few dry leaves against the glass. Something else caught my eye. A slim folder marked, "Accounts." Inside were statements from a savings account I hadn't thought about in years, opened in my name alone. The balance was far higher than I remembered. Harold had been adding to it quietly, even in the last months of his life. I sat back, the leather of the chair creaking. The cold light of morning spilled across the desk, turning the edges of the papers gold. The knot in my chest loosened, just slightly. They didn't know about this account. They didn't know about the note. For the first time in weeks, I felt the ground steady beneath me. Not because I trusted it would hold forever, but because I knew exactly where my footing was. I gathered the documents, sliding them into a fresh envelope. The lock on the filing cabinet clicked shut, the sound final and solid. Outside, the lake shifted from pewter to silver, the first hint of sun breaking through the clouds. There was more to uncover. There always was, but now I had something they didn't, and I intended to keep it that way. By mid-morning, I had made up my mind. The folder in my bag felt heavier than it should, each document a small weight of certainty. If I was going to be sure, I needed a second pair of eyes, and not the kind Daniel could influence. The Lakeview branch of First National sat on the corner by the old post office. Inside, the air smelled faintly of toner and floor polish, the kind of clean that never quite masked the scent of paper and ink. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a steady white glow on the rows of tidy desks. Behind the counter, I spotted Linda Harris. We'd gone to the same church years ago, before she started working at the bank. Her hair was shorter now, but her smile was the same, warm, cautious, the way you greeted someone you hadn't seen in too long. "Margaret Ellis?" she said softly, leaning forward. "It's been a while." "What can I do for you?" I lowered my voice. "I need to review my accounts." Privately, her brow lifted, but she didn't ask why. Instead, she led me to a small office at the back, away from the steady murmur of customers. The door clicked shut, muffling the hum of the lights. I laid the envelope on her desk. "These are the original documents for my property and a savings account I haven't touched in years. I want to confirm everything." Linda slipped on her reading glasses, scanning the pages with practiced care. From time to time, she nodded, making small notes on a pad beside her. When she was done, she tapped the top of the stack. "These are all valid. Margaret, the house is solely in your name, no liens, no secondary signatories. The savings account is active and untouched by anyone but you." A breath I didn't realize I'd been holding slipped out slow. "And what about recent activity? Any new authorizations?" She turned to her computer, fingers tapping the keys in a steady rhythm. The monitor reflected in her glasses, lines of data scrolling past. Finally, she looked up. "There were attempts to add authorized users to your primary checking account last month, but they weren't completed. We flagged them because the signature on file didn't match yours exactly." The room felt warmer suddenly, though I hadn't moved. "Who initiated them?" Linda hesitated, then swiveled the screen toward me. Daniel's name sat there in black and white. Claire's just below it. I traced the edge of the desk with my fingertips. It was one thing to suspect, another to see it typed out plain. Linda's voice softened. "You should consider adding a note to your file, requiring in-person verification for any changes." "I can set that up right now if you'd like." "Wes," I said. My voice didn't waver. "And please print me everything you just showed me." The printer whirred to life, spitting out warm pages that smelled faintly of ink and heat. Linda slid them into a new envelope, sealing it before handing it over. As I stepped back into the main lobby, the sounds returned, the shuffle of feet, the low murmur of conversations, the chime of the door opening. But they felt distant, muffled under the steady beat of my own resolve. Outside, the cold air caught at my breath. The lake shimmered in the distance, the sun breaking through a thin veil of clouds. I tightened my grip on the envelope, feeling the crisp edges against my palm. I wasn't just holding paper, I was holding proof. Something solid in a game they thought I'd already lost. That night, sleep didn't come. The house was quiet except for the wind worrying the shutters and the faint tick of the clock in the hallway. I lay in bed, the envelope from the bank resting on the nightstand like a sentry. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw their names on that screen. Daniel's above Claire's, black letters on a white background. Proof that what I'd felt for months wasn't paranoia. It was intent. At midnight, I gave up on sleep. I slipped into Harold's old robe, the fabric soft from years of wear, and padded to the kitchen. The floorboards creaked under my bare feet, familiar and steady in the darkness. I brewed tea, letting the steam curl into the cold air. The peppermint scent reminded me of winters when Harold would sit by the fire, a book in his lap, telling me, "Maggie, you can't control the tide, but you can choose when to launch the boat." I carried the mug into the living room. The lake lay beyond the window, a silver sheet under the moon. Ripples caught the light, breaking it into shards that winked and vanished. I thought about the years of giving, money, time, trust, without question, and how easily they'd mistaken that for weakness. The truth was, patience had been my currency all along. And now, with proof in my hands, I could decide where and when to spend it. The radiator hissed in the corner, its warmth reaching only partway across the room. I pulled Harold's coat tighter and opened the envelope again. The papers were cool to the touch, edges sharp. Bank statements, property deed, Harold's note. Each one a piece of ground they couldn't claim. I spread them out on the coffee table, arranging them in neat rows. In the dim light, they looked like tiles in a mosaic, each part of a bigger picture I hadn't seen clearly until now. Outside, a gust rattled the bare branches, tapping them against the window like fingers insisting I pay attention. I did. I began making a list in my head, names of people I trusted, places I could store duplicates of these documents, steps to make sure nothing could be moved without my say. So, it wasn't about revenge. Not yet. It was about securing the shoreline before the next storm. When the clock struck 2, I was still at the table, tracing the edge of Harold's note with my finger. "Your security, no matter what happens," he'd written. I felt the words settle into me, quiet but unshackable. By the time the first pale light seeped over the lake, the papers were back in the envelope sealed and tucked into the locked drawer of Harold's desk. I poured the cold tea down the sink, rinsed the mug, and stood at the window. The water was calm now, the surface smooth as glass. It looked peaceful, but I knew what moved beneath. Currents you couldn't see until they pulled you under. And I was done pretending not to feel them. By mid-morning, I decided the papers couldn't all stay here. One place was too easy to breach, especially if someone already had the idea of moving me out. I cleared a space on the kitchen counter and began making copies. The printer hummed steadily, spitting out each page warm and smelling faintly of toner. Property deed, bank statements, Harold's note, all doubled, the ink crisp and certain. I slipped the originals back into the oak filing cabinet, locking it with a twist that clicked deep into the metal. One copy went into a plain brown envelope, unmarked to be tucked away in the safe deposit box at First National. The other copy I sealed in a weatherproof pouch. That one I planned to give to someone I trusted. Emily came to mind first. She had no stake in my property, no reason to side with Daniel or Claire, and she had the quiet kind of loyalty that didn't advertise itself. I called her, keeping my voice even. "Emily, are you working at the library today?" "Yes. Until 3?" she said. "Could you stop by afterward? I have something I'd like to give you." She didn't ask what. That was one of the things I valued about her. She didn't pry until she needed to. The next task was the bank. I drove into town with the brown envelope on the passenger seat, the cold November air seeping through the seams of my coat. The safe deposit box room was small, the air dry and cool. When I slid the envelope into the metal drawer, it made a soft, final sound against the lining. I closed it, locking away the proof like a seed planted deep, waiting for the right season to emerge. Back home, I checked every latch and lock in the house. The windows, the back porch door, the side entrance no one used anymore. I replaced the key in the small tin Harold had kept above the pantry, then moved the tin to a new hiding place only I would know. By the time Emily arrived, the sun was sliding low, the lake catching its last light in streaks of copper and gold. She stood in the doorway, cheeks flushed from the cold. "What's this about?" she asked, stepping inside. I handed her the weatherproof pouch. "I need you to keep this for me. Somewhere safe." Her brows lifted, but she didn't open it. "All right," she said. "Was it something important?" "Less," I said simply. "It's the kind of thing you don't want getting into the wrong hands." She nodded once, slipping it into her bag without another word. The trust was silent but complete. After she left, I made tea and stood at the window. The lake was calm again, its surface reflecting the first stars. My hands no longer trembled when I held the mug. I wasn't ready to act, not yet, but the pieces were moving into place. And this time they were moving because I set them there. On Monday morning, I drove into town just after sunrise. The roads were still slick from the night frost, each patch of ice flashing pale blue under the early light. In the passenger seat sat another envelope, this one containing the documents Linda had printed at the bank. The law office of Bradley and Lowe occupied the top floor of a brick building across from the courthouse. Harold had trusted them for years, especially Mark Bradley, who'd drawn up our wills and property agreements. The place smelled of old paper and lemon polish, a combination that made me think of order and permanence. Mark met me at the door of his office, his handshake firm but not rushed. "Margaret, been too long? Come in, have a seat." The blinds were half open, letting in slanted beams of winter sun that lit the dust motes hanging in the air. A small electric heater hummed in the corner, battling the cold seeping through the window panes. I slid the envelope across his desk. "I need to review and update everything in here, and I want it airtight." He put on his glasses, flipping through the pages slowly. "You've kept these in good condition," he said, glancing at the deed, the bank records, Harold's note. Then his expression shifted, the lines around his mouth deepening. "What's prompted this?" "I've had reason to believe someone's been looking for an opening," I said. "Family?" he asked quietly. I nodded once. Mark leaned back, folding his hands. "All right. First step, we reaffirm ownership of the property. File a fresh copy with the county clerk so there's no question about its status. Next, we put in a legal stipulation: no transfers, no liens, no access without your direct, notarized consent." He turned to his computer, the keyboard clacking under his fingers. Each keystroke felt like another brick going into a wall around my life. "While we're at it," he said, "we can add a clause to your will, naming exactly where the house and accounts will go, and under what conditions. That way, no one can claim ignorance later." I thought of Claire's voice at the party, the way she'd spoken about knowing your place. "Yes," I said, "and make sure those conditions aren't easy to bend." Mark smiled faintly. "Bending will be impossible." We spent the next hour reviewing each document, line by line. The legal language was dense, but Mark explained every clause until I could repeat it back. When we were done, he printed the updated forms, the pages warm and smelling faintly of ink. I signed each one in steady strokes. Mark notarized them on the spot, his seal pressing into the paper with a firm click. "These copies stay with me," he said, sliding a set into his file cabinet. "I'll send certified copies to your safe deposit box. And Margaret, if anyone tries to challenge this, they'll have a fight they can't win." Outside, the air felt sharper, but my steps were lighter. From the sidewalk, I could see the lake in the distance, a band of silver under the pale sky. I knew Daniel and Claire were still moving their pieces, thinking they had time. What they didn't know was that I'd just placed my first move on the board. Back at home, I put the signed copies into the locked desk drawer, turning the key with a quiet finality. The house felt different, still and solid, like it was standing a little closer beside me. No one looking in from the outside would see a change, and that was exactly how I wanted it. The next morning, I brewed coffee strong enough to cut through the gray light seeping in from the lake. Steam curled above the mug as I opened my laptop, the familiar whir of its fan filling the kitchen's quiet. If I was going to keep my ground, I needed to shut every door they might try to open. First stop, the bank's online portal. I typed in my old password, fingers steady, then navigated to the security settings. A new password, 12 characters, numbers, symbols, nothing that tied back to birthdays or addresses. The system confirmed the change with a green check mark, and I felt the smallest thread of tension snap free. Next, I called Linda at First National. Her voice came on the line, warm but businesslike. Margaret, what can I do for you today? I want to revoke all pending authorizations. And I want alerts. Every transaction over $50, no exceptions. There was the quiet tapping of her keyboard. Doan. And I've added a note to your file. No account changes without your physical presence and valid ID. I thanked her, the words carrying more weight than she might have realized. After hanging up, I moved on to the utilities, insurance and tax accounts. Each login was the same process, new passwords, two-factor authentication, paper statements redirected to my P.O. box. The repetitive clicks of the keyboard became a kind of rhythm, each one a lock sliding into place. Outside, snow had begun to fall in slow, deliberate flakes, settling on the bare branches. The lake was nearly still, a sheet of muted silver under the winter sky. I paused long enough to watch the snow thicken, then went back to the work at hand. Midday. I drove to the county clerk's office to request certified copies of the updated property records Mark had filed. The clerk, a woman with kind eyes behind her glasses, handed me the sealed envelope. "Keep this somewhere safe," she said. I nodded, tucking it into my bag like it was more precious than gold. Back home, I stored the envelope in the locked cabinet, then picked up the phone again, this time to cancel an old power of attorney Harold and I had once set up for emergencies. It was outdated, but I wasn't leaving even a sliver of legal access lying around. By late afternoon, the list was complete. Passwords changed. Accounts secured. Documents duplicated and hidden. Every possible door I could think of was bolted tight. I poured another cup of coffee and sat by the window, watching the snow coat the porch railing. The house was warm, the air inside carrying the faint scent of cedar from the wood stacked by the fireplace. No one would look at me and guess the day I'd had. And that was the point. Daniel and Claire would see nothing until there was nothing left for them to take. For the first time in months, I felt the ground under me not just steady, but solid. The next move would be mine, and it would be quiet enough to slip past their guard entirely. If it were you, if you'd been cornered in your own life by people you once trusted, would you fight back in the open, or work in silence until the moment was right? The call was short, deliberate. "Daniel, I need you and Claire to come by tomorrow morning. We have something to discuss." A pause on the line, then his voice, smooth, rehearsed. "Of course, Mom. We'll be there." I spent the evening setting the stage. The dining table was cleared, a fresh pot of coffee set to brew just before they arrived. The documents, property deeds, bank statements, notarized clauses, were stacked neatly in a leather folder, resting at my right hand's reach. Morning came sharp and cold. Frost rimmed the edges of the kitchen windows, and the floorboards under my slippers groaned with each step. I poured the coffee, the rich scent filling the room, bitter and grounding. At exactly 9, their car crunched up the driveway. I watched them from the window, Daniel in his wool coat, Claire in a red scarf that seemed to announce itself before she spoke. They came in without knocking, shaking off the cold like they owned the place. "Morning, Mom," Daniel said, hanging his coat on the rack. Claire didn't bother with a greeting, just scanned the room like she was checking inventory. We sat. The sunlight through the east window fell across the table in narrow bands, cutting the space between us into light and shadow. I wrapped my hands around my mug, letting the warmth seep into my fingers. "So," Daniel began, "you said there's something important." Claire leaned forward, a faint smile on her lips. "Yes, Margaret. We've actually been meaning to talk about some arrangements." I let the silence stretch until the air felt taut. Then I placed the leather folder on the table and opened it with slow precision. The papers fanned out neatly, each one angled toward them. "I've made some changes," I said. Daniel's brow furrowed. Claire's smile didn't move, but her eyes flicked to the documents. "These," I continued, tapping the top page, "are the updated property records. Filed and sealed with the county clerk, the house is and will remain solely in my name, no liens, no transfers, no access granted to anyone but me." And Claire shifted in her chair. Daniel's jaw tightened. "What's this about?" he asked, but his tone had lost its easy gloss. I slid the next set of papers toward them. "These are bank account authorizations. Effective last week, all pending access requests were revoked. Transaction alerts are active, and any changes require my physical presence and ID." Daniel's hand moved toward the papers, but I placed my palm over them. "You don't need to read the fine print. Just know it's final." The room held still. Even the clock on the wall seemed to hesitate between ticks. I wanted you to hear it from me, I said. Because what comes next you'll want to remember. Daniel's eyes narrowed. Claire leaned back, crossing her arms as if to shield herself from something unseen. I reached for the final set of documents in the folder, the paper cool and heavy between my fingers. These, I said, sliding them into the light, are my updated estate plans. Filed, notarized, and witnessed last week? Then Daniel glanced at the title page, Last Will and Testament, before looking back at me. You've changed your will? I have, I replied evenly. The house, the savings accounts, the lakefront lot, they're no longer set to pass to you. Instead, they'll fund the Harold Ellis Memorial Scholarship, available to underprivileged kids from this county. Claire's laugh was sharp, almost brittle. That's ridiculous. You can't just… I can? I interrupted, my voice steady. And I have. Mark Bradley at Bradley & Lowe has the originals. Certified copies are in my safe deposit box. The bank and county clerk both have the updated records. There's no version of this where you change it back without my consent. The smell of coffee, now cooled and bitter, hung between us. Daniel's hand clenched on the table, the tendons in his wrist tight as rope. After everything I've done for you, I raised an eyebrow. What you've done for me? The words settled in the air, sharp as glass. Claire shifted in her seat, the legs of her chair scraping against the wood floor. That money should stay in the family, she said. It will, I replied, if you consider this county my family, and frankly I do. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. Outside, sunlight flickered off the lake, sending fractured light across the wall behind them. You think you're punishing us? Daniel said finally, his voice low. I'm not punishing anyone, I said. I'm protecting what's mine and making sure it's used where it's wanted. Their silence was heavy, like a room sealed against air. Daniel looked at Claire, then back at me. Is there anything else? I closed the folder with a soft thud. Yes, I said, rising from my chair. There's one more thing you need to understand before you walk out that door. The legs of my chair scraped lightly against the floor as I stood. From here, the light caught the edges of the folder in my hand, a muted gold glow against the leather. I stepped toward the sideboard where a smaller envelope waited. One I hadn't touched until now. I set the smaller envelope on the table, sliding it toward Daniel. This, I said, is a printed record from the bank. It shows every attempt made to gain access to my accounts in the last 60 days. Daniel didn't reach for it. Claire did. Her fingers hesitated on the flap, as though touching it might burn. She pulled out the pages, her eyes flicking over the lines of text. There, in plain black letters, were their names. The dates and times matched the weeks they'd just been checking in on me. Claire's lips pressed into a hard line. Daniel's shoulders went rigid. You had no right to dig into? I had every right. I cut in. It's my account. And the bank flagged your attempts because the signatures didn't match mine. The winter light coming through the window seemed sharper now, slicing the space between us. Claire shoved the papers back into the envelope, her hands tight enough to wrinkle the edges. This isn't what you think, Daniel said, but the conviction in his voice was already fraying. It's exactly what I think, I replied. You saw me as a door you could walk through anytime you wanted. What you didn't realize is that I built locks you don't have keys for. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen, steady and indifferent. Daniel glanced toward the door, the muscle in his jaw working. Claire stood, her scarf catching the light like a flare of red in the pale room. You'll regret this, she said quietly. I took a step closer to the table, resting my hand on the folder. No, what I'd regret is letting you believe my silence was permission. For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, marking time we'd never get back. Finally, Daniel stood, his chair scraping the wood. He didn't look at me as he pulled on his coat. Claire followed, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. I stayed by the table as they walked to the door. When it closed behind them, the latch catching with a soft final click, the air in the house seemed to shift. The sunlight had moved, spilling farther across the floorboards, warming the edge of the rug beneath my feet. I gathered the documents, sliding them back into the leather folder, and carried it to Harold's desk. The drawer shut with a solid sound, the key turning easily in the lock. Outside, their car rolled down the drive, the engine fading until it was gone. I stood in the quiet, the scent of coffee still lingering, and breathed in deeply, The house was mine. More importantly, so was my peace. For 3 days, the phone didn't ring. Not from Daniel, not from anyone in his circle. The house settled into a kind of stillness I hadn't felt in years. No sudden visits, no questions disguised as casual chats. Just the creak of the floorboards when I moved from room to room, and the low hum of the furnace working against the cold. On the morning of the 4th day, frost feathered the edges of the windows, catching the pale winter light. I made oatmeal and coffee, the steam curling into the air, carrying the earthy scent of cinnamon I'd sprinkled on top. The quiet wasn't empty. It was clean, like the space left after a storm has passed. I sat at the kitchen table, my hands wrapped around the mug, and let my mind wander. It drifted to birthdays Daniel had skipped, to the weeks he'd call only when bills were due, to the look on his face the night Harold's will was read. I had ignored too many signs, softened too many edges, telling myself it was just the way families worked. The mantel above the fireplace held photographs. Harold and me on the dock, Daniel as a boy with skinned knees and a fishing pole. The 3 of us one Christmas in matching sweaters. They were a record of a life, but some of them had begun to feel like records of a fiction. The fire popped, sending a spark into the grate. I leaned back in my chair, watching the flames catch on the log, the smell of burning cedar mixing with the faint scent of Harold's old pipe that still lingered in the wood. For the first time in months, my shoulders weren't tight. Around noon, I stepped outside. The air was crisp, carrying the faint metallic taste that comes just before snow. The lake was still, the surface smooth and cold, mirroring the gray sky above. I walked to the shed at the edge of the property, its door stiff with winter. Inside, I found the boxes I hadn't touched since Harold's passing. Old receipts, his tackle box, photo albums from before Daniel married Claire. Dust motes drifted in the beam of light from the doorway, moving slow, unbothered. I carried a few boxes back inside and set them by the fireplace. The cardboard was cool under my hands, the tape brittle with age. I wasn't sure yet what I would keep, what I would let go, but I knew this was the right place to start. The living room felt warmer with the boxes there, as if they'd brought some of Harold's steadiness back with them. I ran my hand over the top of one, feeling the raised edge where the tape had peeled slightly. There was no rush now, no one waiting to pounce on what I hadn't protected. The house, the life inside it, the future I wanted. They were all mine to arrange piece by piece. By late afternoon, the sun broke through a thin seam in the clouds, spilling light across the rug and the corner of Harold's desk. I moved one of the boxes there, ready to open it when the next quiet evening came. In the days that followed, the stillness became something I woke up looking forward to. The morning light would pour in through the east window, pale and thin at first, then softening into gold by mid-morning. The house breathed with me, slow, unhurried, unbothered by footsteps that didn't belong here anymore. At the grocery store, Mrs. Lang from the post office stopped me by the canned goods aisle. "Haven't seen Daniel and Claire around," she said, tilting her head in curiosity. I smiled faintly, adjusting the basket on my arm. "They're keeping to themselves," I said. It was the truth, even if not the whole of it. Back home, I kept working through the boxes by the fireplace. Some held memories that still warmed me. Harold's fishing cap, a ticket stub from our trip to Maine, the little brass compass he'd carried in his pocket for decades. Others brought a dull ache, a framed photo from Daniel's graduation, a letter he'd written asking for money, just until next month. I set aside what I wanted to keep in a cedar chest, the wood rich with that deep, comforting scent. The rest went into donation bins or to the burn pile out back. Each item gone felt like another layer of weight lifted from the air. One afternoon, as I sorted through a stack of Harold's old books, I found a note tucked between the pages of a weathered novel. In his familiar slanted hand it read, "For when you're ready to turn the page." Sir, I sat there for a long moment, the book open in my lap, listening to the faint whistle of the wind slipping through the eaves. The lake outside had begun to freeze along the edges, the ice catching the afternoon sun in fractured patterns. From the porch, I could hear the occasional creak of the frozen surface shifting, a low, resonant sound like a warning and a promise all at once. Inside, the warmth from the fire filled the living room, making the shadows on the walls softer. I settled into Harold's old armchair, its cushions molded to the shape of someone who'd sat and thought a lot about life. The chair creaked as I leaned back, the sound familiar and grounding. By evening, the boxes were nearly gone, their contents either tucked into safe corners or carried out to the shed. The space felt lighter, cleaner, not just in the absence of clutter, but in the absence of the past trying to press itself forward into the present. I lit a single lamp on the side table and watched the circle of light spill across the rug. For the first time in a long while, I felt the house and I were in step, as if we'd agreed on what belonged here and what didn't. Tomorrow, I would start something new, something that wasn't about guarding against loss, but about building for the future. The thought didn't scare me, it steadied me. The wind picked up outside, rattling the bare branches against the siding. I listened for a moment, then closed the last empty box and slid it into the hall closet. The work was done. What came next would be mine to choose. By early spring, the ice on the lake had melted into long, rippling ribbons of silver. The air carried the smell of wet earth and pine, the kind of scent that told you winter had finally loosened its grip. I'd spent the past months not just guarding what was mine, but shaping it into something worth passing on. The Harold Ellis Memorial Scholarship was official now, its first applications already coming in from students at the high school. Reading their letters at the kitchen table, I felt a quiet pride settle in my chest. This was what Harold would have wanted, opportunity planted like seeds in young hands. The house had changed too. The rooms once heavy with unspoken tension were now open and bright. I'd cleared the front parlor and lined the walls with bookshelves, filling them with novels, history, and Harold's old collection of field guides. On Saturday afternoons, I left the door unlocked and a small sign by the gate, "F Community Reading Room All Welcome." The first time neighbors came, they hesitated on the porch, as if unsure they were really invited. But soon the sound of turning pages and quiet conversation filled the space. Last week, a group of children sat cross-legged on the rug, passing picture books between them while their parents drank coffee in the kitchen. Their laughter moved through the house like fresh air. On baking days, the scent of cinnamon and butter would drift into the hallway, mingling with the faint tang of old paper. Sometimes I'd catch a whiff of Harold's pipe tobacco from the armchair by the window. Though I knew it was just memory rising in the warmth, I spent mornings on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the lake shift colors under the changing sky. Without the weight of constant watchfulness, my days stretched wider, filled with the small tasks that make a life feel whole: mending a quilt, pruning the garden, writing letters to old friends. One afternoon, Emily stopped by with a stack of books she thought the reading room could use. We stood by the shelves, sliding the spines into place, and I realized the house no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like it was breathing again, like it belonged as much to the people who found comfort here as it did to me. Looking out at the lake through the open window, I felt the kind of peace that doesn't come from shutting the world out, but from letting the right parts of it in. The future wasn't something to guard against anymore. It was something to welcome. The idea for the gathering came on a warm April morning. The lake shimmered under the sun, and it felt right to bring people together here, not for a holiday, but for something that would outlast any single day. I set out folding chairs on the grass near the dock, the air carrying the fresh scent of budding lilacs. Emily arrived early, helping me arrange a table with lemonade, iced tea, and a plate of oatmeal cookies still warm from the oven. By noon, neighbors began to arrive, faces I'd known for decades, and a few new ones I'd only waved to in passing. The students came in pairs and small groups, shy but curious. Some clutched manila envelopes with their applications. Others just wanted to meet the woman whose name they'd seen on the scholarship forms. I shook every hand, looking each one in the eye, hoping they could feel how much this mattered to me. When everyone had settled, I stood near the water's edge, the dock's weathered boards warm under my shoes. The sunlight danced on the ripples, casting shifting patterns onto the faces turned toward me. "I won't take much of your time," I began, my voice carrying just enough over the breeze. "This place, this home, and the lake beside it, they've given me more than I could ever repay. And now, I want to give something back." I told them about the Harold Ellis Memorial Scholarship, how it would help local students pursue their education without the weight of financial worry. I didn't speak of Daniel or Claire, or of what it had taken to protect what I had. This day wasn't about loss. It was about planting something that would grow long after I was gone. There was a quiet moment after I finished, the kind that feels fuller than applause. Then someone began to clap, and the sound spread until it filled the space between the lake and the trees. We spent the afternoon talking in small circles, children chasing each other across the grass while the adults lingered over tea. Laughter mingled with the soft lap of water against the shore, and for once, time felt like it was on my side. As the sun lowered, painting the lake in streaks of gold and rose, I walked to the end of the dock. The air was cooler now, the scent of lilacs mixing with the faint tang of the water. I closed my eyes for a moment, breathing it in. Behind me, voices carried from the yard, friends, neighbors, and strangers who now felt a little closer. Ahead of me, the horizon seemed wide open. The house was safe. The future was set in motion, and for the first time in years, I wasn't guarding the door. I was holding it open. Looking back now, I see it clearly. Every quiet step, every door I closed, and every one I chose to open. Losing trust in your own blood is a wound that never quite fades, but it doesn't have to define you. I didn't fight to keep everything. I fought to keep myself. The house by the lake still stands, but it's no longer a fortress. It's a place of warmth, of stories, of futures being built one young mind at a time. Daniel and Claire became a chapter I've already turned, not a shadow over the pages ahead. I learned that dignity isn't something people give you. It's something you refuse to let them take. And the best revenge, if you want to call it that, is a life lived freely, with the doors wide open to those who value them. When the wind moves across the water at sunset, I hear Harold's voice in the quiet. It's not goodbye. It's a reminder to keep walking forward, to keep the keys that matter, and to never ever hand them to the wrong hands again.